Hello, my name is Andres, and I'm going to present an overview of my PhD thesis. Take in mind that I still have 6 months to finish, so expect to find some gaps, but hopefully those gaps will be filled soon. And get ready and enjoy. First, I need to briefly introduce some concepts. First of all is the EPT life cycle. EPTs, they spend most of their life living in the water, but at some point they emerge, they reproduce, and generally speaking, they disperse by flying upstream and trying to lay their eggs as far as possible. This dispersion flights, as any movement by any organism, is affected by landscape features. So that's what is called landscape connectivity. For example, human-made structures could act as a barrier, while more covered and protected areas can be helping the animals to move faster or longer distances, and open areas maybe could hindering their movement. In the specific case of the riparian forest, as I mentioned, is in general assumed that it improves the landscape connectivity for EPTs, although this is not always the case, not for every species, not in every situation, and this is quite tricky to empirically prove. And this is tricky partly because it's not very well known what's the mechanism linking the riparian forest with the EPT landscape connectivity. For example, could be changes in light polarization, or could be provision of refuge. But generally speaking, again, this is a topic very hard to empirically test. So the main focus of the main objective of my thesis is trying to put a little bit of light on this relation between riparian forest and landscape connectivity for EPTs. The last idea I want to present you is that it should be possible to study landscape connectivity through the EPT community composition, in the same way that one can study saproic pollution by looking at the EPT community composition. The idea is that places with high connectivity will have a big proportion of weak dispersers, while places with low connectivity will just have strong dispersers, because the weak dispersers won't be able to reach that place even if the habitat is especially good. So again, the EPT community composition can be used to assess the landscape connectivity for EPTs of a given site. With this idea, we started my thesis. And the first thing that I needed to do is to find a way to assess the EPT dispersion capacity. If we want to know if a given community have a lot of strong disperser or weak dispersers, we need to be able to classify the EPTs into strong or weak dispersers. So the first thing that we did, it was to look at what was published, which experimental, which empirical data was published for European EPT species. And we compiled all of it in a European EPT dispersion database. The main issue is that this database covered less than 10% of the species, and therefore is not enough data to use just this to assess the EPT dispersion capacity. So we thought on indirect ways of assessing EPT dispersion capacity. And a lot of researchers have been used traits as proxies for EPT dispersion capacity, or traits to build a little bit more complex dispersion indices. We selected a group of these, and we decide to test them to see which one of all these indices is the best way to assess dispersion capacity. To do so, we simply used the empirical data that we had in our database and saw which one of the indices was the best at predicting that empirical data. And the answer was clear. The species flying propensity by Sorremellani and his colleagues was the best one, and therefore it is the tool that we will use the rest of my thesis to assess EPT dispersion capacity and therefore landscape connectivity for EPTs. So with our tool ready, it's time to start looking at the relation between riparian forest and landscape connectivity for EPTs, but also to understand better what can we do or which things need to take in mind when studying this relation. So we did a study in the continental biogeographical region of Europe in northwest Germany. We had around 100 sites, and in each site we had a buffer from 5 to 10 kilometers, more or less, where we study the riparian vegetation. From each site, using the community composition, we calculated the EPT dispersion index. So remember, this is the landscape connectivity. And we used different predictors, including the riparian vegetation, and see which one of these predictors correlate with the landscape connectivity. The first thing that worried us is if our index will work properly or if it would be confounded with some other parameters. Like, for example, saproic pollution, it affects the EPT community structure, or landscape anthropization can also affect the EPT community structure. And therefore, we were worried if our index was directly correlated with any of these measurements, and therefore not really measuring dispersion, but better measuring saproic pollution, for example. And we were relieved to know that that wasn't true. So it seems that we chose a right way to measure dispersion and therefore landscape connectivity. We look firstly at the region. In our study area, we had half of our sites in the mountain streams and half of the sites in lowland streams. And indeed, we found that riparian forest is promoting landscape connectivity, but just in the mountain streams, but not in the lowland streams. So that means that it's important to take into mind like these smaller regions when looking at this relation. We also look at two different spatial scales to understand which one was the right one for our methods. We look at the regional scale where we compare different sites, and we look at the local scale where we compare two locations in each one of our sites. And it was clear that our tools were the right ones for the regional, for the more bigger scale, and they don't have enough resolution to work at these smaller spatial scales. Related with the scale, we also look at the buffer width, and we found out that the vegetation in the 30 meters and in the 10 meters buffer is equally important for the landscape connectivity for EPTs. Finally, we also look at the type of forest, and it was clear that it was the deciduous forest, the forest that was increasing landscape connectivity for EPTs in mountain streams. On the other hand, it seems that coniferous forest is most likely acting as a dispersion barrier. This is not something that we can say for sure, but our data is hinting us that, and this is in line with data from other studies published by other researchers. So good, we know that indeed riparian forest, at least under certain conditions, increases landscape connectivity for EPTs, and we also know which things we need to take in mind to study this relation. So we want to expand our study to other areas, because maybe the riparian forest will have a different importance under different climatic conditions, for example. So we had three study areas: the continental one, the one that I showed you before, the alpine one in Tyrol, and the Mediterranean one in Portugal. You already saw the results for the continental one. We didn't found any effect on lowland streams of riparian vegetation, but in mountain streams, the forest was providing connectivity for EPTs. This is where we are now. We are still analyzing the data for the other two regions, so I will tell you what I expect to find. In the Mediterranean region, I expect to find a bigger impact of riparian forest because it's an arid and warmer region, and therefore the forest can be more important to provide refuge. In the Alpine region, I expect to find a smaller effect of riparian forest because most likely the topography is the main driver of the landscape connectivity in that region. Finally, we also want to look at potential scenarios, future scenarios in the frame of climate change. As we know, climate change is impacting the water temperature of freshwater ecosystems by increasing them, and increases in water temperature can translate into phenological changes for EPTs, particularly for the emergency period, which can trigger a series of changes in the world community. On the other hand, we also know that riparian forest, by shadowing, can reduce the temperature of the water and therefore ameliorate the negative effect or the effect of the climate change, and therefore ameliorate the effect on the EPT phenology. So in conclusion, about the first chapter, the main conclusion is that we don't have enough empirical data. The indices are quite neat, but it would be fine, it would be quite nice to have more experimental data. In the second chapter, we saw that indeed riparian forest can increase landscape connectivity for EPTs, at least under certain conditions. In the third chapter, we want to see if indeed the role of riparian forest changes between biogeographical regions. And in the fourth chapter, we want to do some predictions on how climate change will generate phenological changes on EPTs, but on the other hand, how the riparian forest could ameliorate those changes. That's all on my side. Thank you very much.